Hey guys, Fallen here. It's been a month since Age of Mythology launched, and we've seen a lot of updates from the developers in this month. We've seen two major patches with tons of gameplay and balance changes. The first patch was just a lot of changes because at launch you can't always tell how much the units and gameplay is balanced. Now, the second patch was actually just as large, and they were trying to address a lot of the problems that we've had in the first few weeks of playing, and they fixed a lot of these issues. And this actually gives me a lot of hope that in near future, in the next year, 2 years, we will see a lot more activity from the developers where they balance and tweak a lot of the gameplay, and it'll continue to feel fresh with a lot of DLCs announced. The trailer of the Chinese DLC, I think it's being called the Immortal Pillars expansion. It's already online, and while we don't have a release date yet, it's great for the game that we already know where we are headed. I know this Pantheon already existed in the extended edition. However, there were complaints for balancing, etc. And it's been sort of redesigned from ground up, and you can already see all the units, all the myth units, everything looking great. I think the Titan was also showcased. I think we'll see it in a second. Okay, so the hopeful future out of the way, let's look now into the first month of data and see how the major gods have been performing. As usual, a big shout out to Gerbot, who built and maintains aomstats.io, and that's where I'm getting all of my data from. In the first month, the biggest win I would say was for Gaia, who had very low play rate in the beginning, and it absolutely doubled, at least for average to below average players. And the same for her win rate, which has gone after so many buffs in the past months from bottom 2 to top 5. Okay, next let's start looking at the 1200 plus elo, because that's where most of our focus will be for this analysis. A rough gist of first month of changes would be that Atlanteans got massive buffs all over the board. Prometheans did get nerfed, however there was a certain strategy that was making them really annoying with Kronos, so that's understandable. Greek Pantheon did get a lot of nerfs, however their heroes in early game have received some buffs, and overall they don't seem to be performing very well. They also had to balance a few things with Egyptians because Set and Isis they felt a bit too strong, whereas Ra was bottom of the chart, and we see some of this coming into play. And of course Norse were leading the charts upon release, and now Odin has been toned down quite a bit. Looking at the 1200 plus elo data, the winner of course right now is Isis, who's doing very well, followed by Kronos, Loki, Thor, and Odin. However, Odin does seem a bit toned down from before. We will also look into how each god matchup is playing right now and try to see if anything stands out. In terms of win rates, Isis is the current leader. However, there is not much difference between the top three right now. Kronos has seen a big increase in win rates, Thor as well. The previous top three major gods, Odin, Poseidon, and Set, have both received a fair bit of nerf. Next we see Uranus and Gaia, and both have actually a decent bit of increase from last time, especially Gaia, who was I think the bottom 2, and now she's in the middle of the pack and definitely a lot more popular and doing well at low elos. Hades and Zeus, they haven't received that big of a nerf, it's just their position has stayed where it was. And Ra has had a 4 to 5 point increase as well in win rates, and that's good because he was trashed here before. Overall result of this is that instead of 16% discrepancy between Odin and Ra in the first patch, now we have about a 10% difference between the top tier god and the bottom tier god. So the developers are really doing something right here, and this makes me excited to how the future will look like, because it's not easy to balance pantheons which are asymmetrical in gameplay, and yet they have done a very good job of it. Let's start looking at the data we have versus each god, starting with Isis. And there is much to like here. For being a top god, she doesn't have that broken of stats. There are still gods like Poseidon and Uranus that do really well against her in some situations. Yes, the base size of data is still quite low for higher elo, but I think it's a good indication of where we are headed. Kronos has his own strengths and weaknesses. He's doing very well against slow, boomy kind of gods like Gaia, Freyr, Hades. However, he is not doing so well against a more aggressive gods like Loki and Thor. Loki also seems to be doing okay, especially doing well against Gaia and Zeus. Next we have Thor, and he's done very well after the last two patches. I think he's one of the few major gods that haven't received any direct big nerf. And so while other Norse gods have seen a slight decrease in their win rates, he seems to be excelling against Zeus and Hades. Next we have the All-Father Odin. He used to be strong. We can still see that he has very strong stats against many of the slower gods, Gaia, Freyr, and also doing very well against Uranus. Now Poseidon, he has lost a few percentage points, however he's still doing very well across the board. The dip in his performance just seems to be from the fact that Uranus and Gaia have been buffed, and now they are holding their own against him. Set as well is not really down for the count, he's just not doing so well against Isis and Uranus. Uranus is not doing bad at all. He's about midway, about 50% win rate, and he has his moments, especially against the Greek pantheon, against whom he's pretty effective. However, then his worst score is against Hades, so maybe he's just not doing well against archers, but good against cavalry play. Most of Gaia's bonuses are economy focused, so while she's not doing very well against some of the top tier civs who have some fast rush available to them, she is very strong against any of the slower civs which take time to develop. She just can outboom them. Now at the bottom of the stack, here is where I see the bright future for Age of Mythology. Even with bottom tier civs, you still have areas against some gods where you will be able to win. Freyr has a good chance against Uranus and Gaia. And while Hades has received a lot of nerfs in the previous patches, he still has some gods against whom he seems outright unfair, particularly Ra and Uranus. Ra was before at the bottom with 39% win rate, and yes, he still has very bad win rates against some gods. Against Set and Zeus, he is doing very well and also equating the boom of Freyr. Okay, finally, so the loser of this patch, currently Zeus, but yet he's not so bad. Like, you still have your opportunities against, for example, Odin, where you have an equal chance to win. Okay, so the developers are not really trying to balance all aspects of each pantheon. Sometimes they try to tweak the early game, sometimes they try to tweak the late game. So let's now look at how each god is doing against time. So do they have an early game that is strong? Do they have a late game that is strong? And how have the recent updates changed that? Now for Isis, we don't have a big change in win rate. She's about the same as she was upon launch. She seems to have a very strong mid game, and that has kind of stayed the same throughout all patches. What has been addressed is the late game, where Egyptian pantheon had a lot of buffs, and now that is the reason why she is doing very well across the board, because at no point she is weak during a game. Okay, so if you're playing Isis, you have some very good timings that you can hit. If you go fast to Classic Age, you have Plague of Serpents, which you can use to take good fights. And after that, you have Ancestors. Again, both are timed, but both are very strong. And of course, you still have access to both Son of Osiris if the situation calls for it, or Meteor, which is an overall S tier god power. Next we have Kronos. In the first patch you didn't see anything extraordinary apart from a strong late game. However, ever since the Promethean rush has been figured out for him, his start game is really S tier. There is nobody that can compete with that. Atlantean Pantheon also received a lot of buffs in the last patch, so overall I do expect him to stay up top in terms of win rates. And so it's not surprising that Kronos is at his best in the current patch against slower gods like Ra, Freyr and Hades. And optimally you are trying to close the games early, so don't wait till endgame. For Loki, initially we saw that he had a very strong late game because you could convert all the villagers to berserks for free. However, that is not the case anymore, and not just the cost has increased for conversion. It's no longer free even for Loki, and he has to pay 50% of that increased cost. Okay, so according to the current data, I think it's best if you focus on winning with Loki in the mid game, where you have a big mass of Herseers and you take a fight, get a lot of myth units for free, and you try to close out the game. Thor is the one where we didn't have any direct nerfs. However, he's actually doing quite well just because all the other stronger gods have been nerfed. And now his overall win rate has gone just above 50%, and that's brought his overall win rate to above 50%. Thor's best matchups are Zeus, Hades, Kronos, Freyr, and Gaia. Kronos and Gaia in particular have seen an increase in play, and that in turn has led to him performing really well. Next we have Odin, and he used to be really strong in the first patch where he was just unbeatable in early game. He's still very strong, and all you have to do is be mindful of the early game nerfs that he received with lower scouting and less food from the Great Hunt. In terms of win rates, he's favorable against some of the slower gods like Gaia, Freyr, Uranus and Ra. Next we have Poseidon, again a god who has received slight nerf. He had a very strong early game and he continues to do so. It's actually even stronger now that Lure has been fixed, where you are not able to research economic upgrades from Lure, which is supposed to act just as a granary now. On release, the late game for Poseidon was super strong and it almost seemed like there was no way to beat it. However, they have received a lot of nerfs for their myth units and general units like Toxotis. So now it seems a bit normalized in the late game, with other civilizations also having a chance. Looking at the matchups, the best matchup again is against slower gods like Ra, Zeus, Hades and Freyr, which is probably due to his strong early game. Although he's doing pretty decent against all Egyptian gods, Isis and Set as well. Now coming to Set, his early game was super strong in the first patch, and that has been reduced a little bit. As you can see, Animals of Set was nerfed. However, he has received nerfs in other stages of the game as well, where the Plague of Serpents is now nerfed, where it spawns fear snakes. They do less damage. Also, other key aspects, for example, Scorpion Man was also nerfed. So there's a lot of changes that were made that is making his mid to late game worse, and that's the reason why he's so low in the charts now. Even with all these nerfs, he's still very good against most of the Norse gods and just gods where you make a lot of army and they're clumped together, especially with Plague of Serpents and the Scorpion Man doing just so much damage. Uranus has had a tough time in Age of Mythology Retold, even though he has one of the best god powers in the Archaic Age called Shockwave. You can see that that's not really leading to a high win rate upon release, and as time has gone on it has become better, and Atlanteans in general have received a lot of help from the developers, with some buffs to their myth units and definitely a lot of buffs to their hero units. They now are in an excellent position in the late game. And looking at his best matchups, he really does very well against any Egyptian civilization and Zeus and Poseidon. Now looking at Gaia, she's one of those traditional boom a lot and then win late game kind of gods. And you can see that was not really working out well for her, with a lot of civs going for very aggressive strategies. Though with them getting nerfed and a number of buffs to Gaia both in early game and late game, she's now doing very well. And with this we also see a trend that once a god receives a lot of buffs, we see the play rate actually shoot up, and that's the same for Gaia, where her play rate has just doubled after the 2 patches. Now the buffs to her are extensive. Economic guild upgrades, the cost reduction has gone from -30 to -40 now. She is now also reducing cost of buildings by 40%. She also has a double wood bonus in the early game, with now 250 starting wood and then lush of course available to her. Then in late game, myth units have been buffed, human units have been buffed, all hero units have been buffed as well. So there's really nothing that can go wrong if you're playing with Gaia. In terms of best matchups, it's the Greek pantheon where she excels against. However, Ra and Set also have a disadvantage when they are playing against her with that solid boom. Now, Freyr is the latest god that has been added to Age of Mythology, to the Norse pantheon. Now, when you're adding a defensive god, what you want to do is you want them to be at a disadvantage in early game, and as the game goes on, or at least in the mid to late game, you want them to be strong. And this was not really happening with Freyr at launch because of aggressive civilizations. And once those civilizations have been nerfed, and Freyr kind of has kept the power level, you can now see after the 3rd patch that the gameplay feels much more as intended. His best matchups are Uranus and Gaia, and a lot of the defensive civilizations you would feel just about even, and he's also about even matchup with Loki. Now coming to my favorite god when I started playing this game, which is Hades. His win rate has been about the same from launch to the next 2 patches. However, at launch, and I believe even now, most pros believe him to be one of the S tier gods. And unsurprisingly, he has received a lot of nerfs, and especially to Toxotes, who seemed quite broken in the hands of pros. And you can see that he just received a lot of nerfs all over the board. So in the current situation, he plays out like a defensive god, where late game is much better than early game, and you want to survive the first 8 to 10 minutes. And obviously his best matchups are gods who are finding it difficult to put pressure in the first 8 to 10 minutes, like Uranus, Ra, and Zeus. Ra is one of the, I won't say defensive, economy focused gods, and due to that and aggressive plays being a meta these days, he's not really doing very well in the early to mid game, and at that point he's just lost his game, and all the bonuses that you can give him for economy are not really helping out. That said, he still has 2 good matchups, which are Zeus and Set. And finally, we are at Zeus. Of course, he didn't have a good win rate to begin with. However, it's just gotten worse now with the whole Greek pantheon receiving a slew of nerfs from the developers to try to fix Hades and Poseidon. So now maybe they will also buff him in the next patch, maybe to get him kind of average at least, because now he feels below average to play. However, let's see how this is fixed. A key thing to remember here is he's not absolutely bad. You still have good matchups where you can at least have an equal fight, especially Odin and Freyr. And then, yeah, we would probably need to wait and see once his overall gameplay is improved. Overall, the game is in a very good state. We have a development team that is bringing in all the changes that will make it better to sustain the gameplay long term. They have new DLCs planned, and Age of Mythology is maintaining a consistent player base. I think it's on Steam, it's hovering somewhere close to 10,000 to 12,000 active players every day. And this is great. You can find matches usually between 3 to 5 minutes max. So who is winning in the first month? And a cheeky answer I would say is us Age of Mythology players, because most of the major gods have some strengths, some weaknesses, and there is a lot of balanced gameplay that is going on, and this is good for the game in the long run. So that's all for now. See you next time.